Mr. Phobes here. This is the second mini lesson in value and how we're going to use it. This is going to be on our next project in value called spacecraft. And we're going to construct both ambiguous space and deep space within the grayscales. And this is just we'll go over this again. This is an example of ambiguous space where there's no apparent foreground, middle ground, background. And then this is an example of deep space where we have a very obvious foreground, middle ground, and background. So, one of the things about thinking about space in two dimensions, first of all, space is not an element of two-dimensional design. It is an element of three-dimensional design because we walk around in it. But in two-dimensional design, it's not an element. We need the elements of line, texture, shape, value, and color, and we can do it without color to really create the sense of depth or space. Drawings, paintings, prints are all flat and may strive to create the illusion of space or depth. So here we see a painting by Gustave Caillebotte, and we can see that it creates this illusion of deep space. We have a very obvious foreground, the two people walking towards us, the middle ground, which are the people on the plaza, and then the background, which are the buildings. And we'll talk about how all that is constructed here. There's a lot of ways to show depth. Maybe in your drawing classes you've taken linear perspective. So that's not going to be included in this discussion. So all of the numbers here that are highlighted in the pink color are going to be what we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about size, overlap, vertical location, and aerial perspective. Those are going to be our four main devices to create the illusion of spatial depth. We'll talk a little bit about amplified perspective, and then we're going to use open form composition, and then ultimately we're going to work with transparency to create what's called ambiguous space. This is just an example of atmospheric perspective here. Okay, so size, which is one of the principles of design, is one way to indicate space. So if you have large objects, they seem like they're coming forward, and small objects seem like they're receding. If you have objects that are the same or very close to the same, it's easier to affect that illusion because we identify it as the same object just going back in space. There they are, similar shapes repeating. You don't need a horizon line in this project. I just used it because of the boats, but it's not absolutely necessary. It again sort of helps set the stage for the recession in space. So overlap. Overlap is probably the strongest spatial device to create this illusion of depth. So if you look at this, we have several different shapes overlapping. Try and figure out what's in the foreground, and then see how that object overlaps. Let's go back here. If we look at this, we can see that in the foreground we've got this handsome guy with the racket, and he's certainly in front because of scale in relationship to the woman. And there in front of the building, you can see by the interior structure, because they're overlapping that. The interior structure is then overlapping the middle ground where we see people in the background, and way back beyond the exterior window there we see somebody with an umbrella. And you can see how scale works in this. So the larger objects come forward and the smaller objects recede, but in addition overlap really helps a lot. So here we have the same construction of the boats. This time there's more boats and they're overlapping. So we've got overlapping with diminishing scale, and that reinforces the illusion of spatial depth. Vertical location is another way to do that. Before linear perspective was discovered in the Renaissance, the way that the allocation of depth was where the image was in its vertical location in the picture plane. So anything that was low in the picture frame was considered to become forward, and anything higher up recedes. But you can see what's interesting here is the figures are all the same scale. There is a little bit of overlap that does help, but the scale seems to throw this off a little bit to certainly Western eyes. But you can see that the objects that are higher up in the picture plane seem to be receding. Here's a famous collage by Tom Wesselman. Same problem. Everything is about the same scale, but if you see where they're located within its vertical orientation in the picture plane, that tends to give the idea that some objects are further back. So the tin cans that say Cafe Bustelo are in the foreground, and the apple and pear, or that may be a lemon, that are higher up seem like they're on the windowsill in the background. But if you look at it in terms of scale, it doesn't really make sense. They're all about the same scale. So aerial perspective, sometimes called atmospheric perspective, which is the word I like to use, and this is the word that we'll use in any quizzes, is atmospheric perspective. It's the use of color or value to show depth. Color and or value lessens and is less distinct as an object recedes. So in this case, this famous painting by or photograph by Ansel Adams, what's happening is that you can see that towards the foreground, objects are more distinct, there's more contrast, and then way off in the background you can see that the values are actually getting closer together. So you can see the value of the sky and the value of that mountain are getting relatively close, and then there's not much contrast. So in the foreground you see really crisp darks and lights, and in the background they start getting a little bit more hazy. Contours become less distinct, edges are less clear, and that's called atmospheric perspective, which was something that we're going to do in our project. So here's an example of how taking that same boat construction, we have the highest contrast between figure and ground in the absolute foreground, and that is also the largest object. So they're working together, and you can see as the objects diminish in scale, they seem to be receding, but look at how the contrast is changing between the object and the ground. So that sailboat clear in the background is very, very close to the value of the ocean. We've talked about open form in the last lesson, and this is something that we're going to use. This is a good example of open form composition. It's an object that either breaks out of the format or pulls the viewer's eye off the canvas. It creates a casual, informal feeling and is usually cropped in a unique point of view. So this is certainly cropped. We can tell that they're two shoes, although we don't see the entire shoe on either one, but there's enough information for us to put it together to understand that's a shoe. So here's an example if we take that same design and we just crop it. So you can see on the left, surrounded by a lot of negative space, this creates a closed form composition. Whereas if we crop it and crop it closer, the boat in the foreground, we've pretty much cropped off the actual vessel, and all we have left is the sails. So it looks much bigger. Sometimes that's called forcing the picture plane, and it looks like the object is coming off of the picture plane. And then you see that the objects look like they're also going moving in like to the right and moving off the picture frame. So this is another aspect that we're going to explore, is open form composition with this. So this is another thing, is that really contrast in relationship to value is what really gives that illusion. So it can be done either way. If you look at the foreground of the boats, we have the dark black in the foreground, and it's contrasting the background. So the figure of the boat being black contrasted against the gray helps create this come forward. But if you look at the birds, the ground is black and the bird closest to us is white. It's not that either white or black indicate have any kind of spatial indication. It's the contrast between the two that really does that. So you see the bird in the background is getting closer to the value of the black, so there's less contrast. So on the one on the right, you see that we have overlap, scale change, vertical location, and atmospheric perspective all working together. Um, and that's one of the aspects we're going to explore. Okay. And then we have something called ambiguous space, and that can be achieved through transparency. Sometimes it's called equivocal space. I like the word ambiguous. It's two forms overlap, but both can still be seen as if one were see-through. So there's multiple forms in this example. It does not give us a clear spatial pattern. So if you look at this, it's hard to tell what's in the foreground, what's in the background, what's in the middle ground. So we're doing this intentionally. We want to create this intentional ambiguous space, and we're going to do it with transparency. So equivocal space would be considered purposeful ambiguity, unclear about what is where or what overlaps what.